welcome to Blogging Heads. I am Dr. Robert Farley of the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. With me today is Matt Duss, a policy analyst at the Center for American Progress. How are you doing today, Matt?
Very well, Rob. Nice to hear you.
Good to hear from you as well. You've been traveling a lot lately. It's sort of cut down on our communications, but, you know, it's okay. I don't mind. I don't feel left out or anything like that. Today we are going to talk about a bunch of different things, but we're going to start off with the sort of a general set of observations about the Arab Spring and about sort of the relationship between how the events in one place are affecting the events in other places. I mean, right now, obviously, we have a ton of stuff going on in Egypt, in Palestine, in Libya, and of course in Syria. So, I don't know, Matt, where would you like to start among these places and these ideas?
Well, I think, you know, speaking as Americans, we can kind of frame it provincially and kind of frame it around, we've got President Obama giving a speech this Thursday on events in the Arab world and America's approach and policy toward the Middle East in light of the events of the last months. So I think, yeah, let's get to those things. But I just kind of 2 years after the Cairo speech, I mean, what has happened, and I think more importantly, what has not happened. And I think the Cairo speech was obviously a major set-piece speech to restart or reboot, what have you, America's relationship with the region. And I think Obama said a lot of very important and a lot of very good things in that speech. But unfortunately, the follow-up was extremely lacking, and I think that's the general consensus both here in the States and certainly in the region, is that while he said great things, especially on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, the strategy and the policy for really changing these things and their impact on the ground has really not been there. So I think the speech that's coming in Thursday, I'm looking forward to hearing it. I thought for a while that he really needs to come out with some kind of, you know, a bigger statement about what these events mean for the U.S. in the region. But it's, needless to say, complicated because all these issues, you know, we can't. It's one thing to say the Arab Spring, but then it's also important to look at these countries individually and what's happening there. Right,
exactly. And so what you're looking for really is a summation of the follow-through, or sort of both a summation and a follow-up to the Cairo speech, right? Something that perhaps answers some of the issues and questions that were raised in the Cairo speech, within the context of what's been happening in the last 6 months, you know, basically across the Arab world. This is sort of what you're looking for. Now, is there an indication that this is actually what we're going to see? I mean, is this what we can expect from this speech? I mean, it is being billed as a pretty major speech.
It is.
I understand it.
It is, but I mean, that kind of scares me because given the political moment, given the political calendar, getting into the 2012 election, I mean, this is not generally the moment in which presidents undertake massive, politically expensive policy initiatives, right? But still, I think he's in a moment right now, obviously, shortly after the finding and killing of Osama bin Laden, where he does have some capital to use. And I think it's important that he's using it in this way. But looking at the Cairo speech, I wrote a piece very, you know, just as the Egyptian demonstrations were really taking off, called "Making Good on the Cairo Speech for the American Prospect." You know, looking back at that speech and saying, yes, he said good things, but I think this, and I believe even more so now than when I wrote it, is like this provides an impetus to really embrace what's happening. I mean, there's really no excuse not to at this point.
Right. So, I mean, a friend of mine made an argument that the American policy towards the Arab Spring is effectively, there is an overarching strategic goal, there is an overarching preference for the concept that, at least in most of these cases, that the authoritarian regimes should be replaced by democratic regimes. But there is also a motivation that this should be done with not quite economy of force, but with as little sort of overt U.S. intervention as possible. And we can then we can run down the tally, right, where the United States did very little in the context of Tunisia. The United States' role in Egypt was in the background. It may have been very critical in terms of how the military decided things, but was certainly in the background.
Right.
The U.S. role in Libya has obviously been larger, but is still sort of secondary to France and Britain. And we don't sort of have a sense yet of the U.S. role in Syria. And really, it's still a developing situation for the U.S. role in Syria and Palestine. I mean, would you say that there is sort of a grand strategic animation behind that's driving this, that comes out of the Cairo speech, and however poorly the goals of the Cairo speech have been met?
I would say that I don't notice a detailed strategy apparent yet, but I think there has always been. President Obama has articulated a set of principles, human rights, individual rights, and the idea that different societies, while there are certain non-negotiables for American policy in the world, or should be, just these rights that are inalienable, as it says in the Declaration of Independence. But that different societies and different cultures are going to kind of manifest those and kind of develop institutions around those rights in different ways, and I think that's fine and good. So I've seen that as consistent. I think that's what we saw during the June 2009 demonstrations in Iran. I think President Obama has taken a lot of criticism for not kind of interjecting himself a lot more forcefully in that. I understand that criticism, but I happen to think that what he did was correct. It's hard for a lot of people not to have America at the front of every parade around the world every time people are demonstrating in favor of more democracy. But I think articulating those values and those principles as Obama did, and I think has done during the Arab Spring, has been good. Now that's not to say I do have criticisms, I think, of some of the halting steps here and there, especially in regard to Bahrain. I think Bahrain is, it's admittedly very tough, but you talk about American credibility and the idea that we would first send the Secretary of State to ask the Bahrainis to ease up, and then be answered by the Saudis sending troops over a causeway to crack down on the Shiite demonstrators, Shiite majority demonstrators. That's tough for America's cred in the region and in the world. Even recognizing that Bahrain is playing a very the role of Bahrain in the kind of sectarian divide, and that's been kind of opened up especially by the Iraq War, is also interesting. But.
Now, I want to concentrate on this bit for just a little, because I think, and you just said a word. You said American credibility, and how Bahrain perhaps detracted from America's credibility with regards to a set of stated purposes about what regimes should look like. Another way of saying credibility is that effectively we're trying to send messages to all of these regimes.
Yeah.
And I find this really interesting, because this is obviously a transnational movement, but it's a transnational movement that has had a different character in every one of these states, and where the state reaction has been much different. It seems to me that the United States, and not just the United States, but also European countries and so forth, have made an effort, I think very explicitly in the Libyan case, to send messages to the rest of the states. And I think this was made very, sort of explicitly, where people were saying, are we simply going to allow the Arab Spring to die? Which would have happened if, presumably, in this idea, if Gaddafi had crushed the rebellion. Are we going to send the message that dictators are simply allowed to crush protesters? And I guess all of this talk of credibility and consistency and so forth, I mean, from my point of view, American credibility has almost nothing to do with what's happening in the Middle East right now. I mean, it seems in Syria, for example, the leadership took exactly the message that we were trying to send to Libya, trying to send with Libya, and took an entirely different message. And so I wonder if sort of broadly conceived interventions, which are designed to have these sort of broad message-sending operations, are really very useful or sensible at all. I mean, can we ever expect that we can send a message of credibility to the various regimes? And not just the regimes, the protesters too, right? We know the protesters in Syria. or at least in some sense motivated by the intervention in Libya, by what's happening in Egypt, and so forth. What are your thoughts?
No, I agree with all of that. I mean, I guess it's a question of definitions here when we talk about credibility. I'm talking about specifically Bahrain as a country with which the United States has a pretty close relationship. We've got a very important base there for the Fifth Fleet. So just the idea when we would so obviously and overtly send such a high-profile person like the Secretary of Defense over there to make our preferences known and to just have them kind of just ignored, and not even ignored, just openly rejected. But as to the question of Libya, yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. One of the arguments for it, and I'm speaking as someone who I still have major concerns, but I kind of still come down on the side of the intervention. That argument, we've got to save the Arab Spring by intervening. Well, of course, in the subsequent weeks, we've seen Yemen, Bahrain, Syria. So whatever message was, if there was a message intending to be sent, they didn't get it.
Right.
I mean, there was Anne-Marie Slaughter twittered something the other day, basically saying...
Twitter, how old are you, man? It's called tweeted.
Tweeted something the other day about, we needed to intervene in Bahrain to send a message that dictators couldn't suppress their uprisings, and it was like a tweet from the past. It was like a tweet from a month and a half ago. So yeah, I think we did. It's clear that we did Libya because it was fairly easy. The various. It was less complicated certainly than a place like Syria. Which is, where do we even start with how complicated Syria is, given its relationship with Iran, given its role in the Arab world. I mean, and this is even a place, one of the interesting things is that, these uprisings have been revealing these tensions all over the place, whether it's the U.S. and Bahrain, or whether it's Turkey's relationship with Libya. Turkey first calling for one of the first people to call for Mubarak to step down was Erdogan, but then it comes to Libya, with whom Turkey has a major trade relationship, and they were like, oh, not so fast. And then, of course, Syria here, and the question of Israel, where obviously they're not huge fans of Assad. He's been one of the main people stirring up hatred of Israel in the region, but at the same time, he's the devil they know. He's kept a sort of stability in the region, and they're understandably nervous about what might come next.
Now let's if we could pause and talk a little bit about this, because I know we want to talk about the Arab Spring in Palestine, which is something almost nobody is talking about, right? And nobody in the West is talking about, because it doesn't fit into a set of sort of neat narratives. But I want to talk a little bit more. I've read a couple pieces recently, and maybe you've read a couple pieces too, about the Alawites, about their relationship with the Sunnis, and about Israel's attitude towards the Assad regime, that have gone beyond simply making the argument that this is a case where the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. But there are just strong reasons why Israel might have a strong preference for the current regime in Syria, the Alawite regime in Syria. No matter how hostile it may be on some aspects of foreign policy, that it is considerably less hostile than a multi-party democracy might be in Syria. So I don't know what are your thoughts about that? How much does the sectarian breakdown of Syria matter in terms of what we're looking at in the future from Syria?
I think it matters a lot. As you said, it's Syria is ruled by an Alawite minority, a kind of a small Alawite clique, a group of families, Alawites. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, Alawites are often, by sort of people who don't have any idea what they're talking about, they're often simply called Shiite. The Alawite Shiite check, but there really is some substantial differences.
There is. And this is interesting. This is getting a little bit into the history here. Is the Alawites? Yeah, they're generally regarded as a minority sect of Shiite Muslims, and that was kind of codified in the 70s when Hafez al-Assad took over, the constitution of the Syrian Arab Republic claims that only a Muslim can be president, and many did not consider Alawites actual Muslims. Many, like Salafis, Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda types don't consider Shiites to be Muslims. But, so anyway, they appealed to Musa al-Sadr, who is a leader of the Shiites in Lebanon, and he issued a fatwa in I forget which year, mid-70s, saying that yes, Alawites are Muslims. They are accepted as Shias. So there's been that. That was obviously important for the Assad, for Hafez al-Assad to kind of take the presidency, and that also gets to this enmity with Libya, because Musa al-Sadr, who's a distant cousin of Muqtada in Iraq, disappeared on a trip to Libya in the late 70s. So that's kind of added to the enmity between Syria and also Hezbollah and Libya. But anyway, that's a little history. But yeah, I think the sectarianism does play into it. I think there was a really fantastic blog post that you may have seen from the blog Gay Girl in Damascus. Did you see this one?
I'm not sure if that's the one I read.
Yeah, we'll have to put a link to it on the page. It was these, this young woman writer who has been writing this blog and participating in these demonstrations, and she wrote about how these secret policemen showed up at her home, her family's home, one night, intending to take her away, and how her father, she just recounted this speech that her father gave to these secret policemen, just completely shaming them, saying, listen, people like my daughter, I may not agree with everything that she says, but, kind of secular liberals like my daughter are your best hopes. Because if it's not for people like her, we Sunnis are going to do to you what you Shiites did to us in Iraq. So, I mean, these resentments and these feelings and this anger is still very much alive, and I think it's really, it may be below the surface, but I think there's a real sense that it just takes one event, who knows what that event be, to really unleash the flood here.
Right, and I mean, notwithstanding the fairly long history of brutal oppression by the Syrian regime, it is also understood to be relatively tolerant in a sectarian sense. And this stems from the Alawite nature of the regime, right? I mean, there are still Christians, there are a very small Jewish community in Syria that remains tolerated and so forth. And there is concern that all that's going to go away if the Alawites are swept away and so forth.
Right. I mean, as we saw in Iraq, I mean, it wasn't obviously that the Shiites were oppressed, but the sectarian civil war that happened, it exploded, and it's changed the face of Iraq, and it's changed the face of the region. I mean, this is something that I think Americans especially don't quite understand. As far as we're concerned, the Iraq war is winding down, and let's move on to the next thing, whereas its consequences are going to be with us for decades.
Now, we didn't talk about this beforehand, but I think it's really interesting, and I think you probably have some strong opinions on it. For every one of these every time one of these authoritarian regime collapses, or comes near collapse, we get some articles about how worried Israel is, right? That Israel is extremely worried that the Egyptian regime is collapsing. Israel is extremely worried that Syria, for crying out loud, the Syrian government might collapse. Israel is extremely worried that the current government in Palestine might, etc. I mean, it seems to me that if you take the neoconservatives seriously about what the 2003 Iraq war was supposed to do, it was supposed to create exactly this kind of firestorm in the Middle East, right? And what is it? Who was it? Faster, please, creating regional instability. And Condoleezza Rice said something silly about something. And so, I mean, I guess from the Israeli perspective, was just nobody thinking about this? I mean, was about how valuable stability could be? Or, I mean, why weren't the Israelis then, if they were so worried about stability, why weren't they pushing harder against the Iraq war in 2003?
No, I think they were. I think there were elements in, Israel was not gung-ho for the Iraq war. I think we know that. I think once it became clear that George W. Bush was going to do it and the U.S. was going to do it, they kind of went along and did what they had to do. But I don't. I think there were elements in Israel that supported it, but I'm not with the theory that it was certainly driven by them by an extent. But I think, if you look at, I think that as far as the neoconservatives are concerned, I think that just goes back to the fundamental misconception that neoconservatives have about the ability of military force to shape the international environment and to shape outcomes.
Right.
I mean, you look at something like the Clean Break document, which was written by a number of neoconservatives for Netanyahu, and it's amazing. I mean, it's really just one of the most. It's like it was written on peyote or something. This idea that we could, we're going to move, just kind of topple these regimes, and we're gonna. And one of my favorite parts of it is, okay, we're gonna reinstall a Hashemite monarchy in Iraq after we topple Saddam Hussein, which is, for anyone who knows the history of the Middle East, is hilarious, because that's what we tried after World War I. So they didn't want to figuratively repeat the mistakes of the past. They wanted to literally repeat the mistakes of the past. So yeah, I think it just goes to this fundamental misconception they have about America's ability to kind of move these pieces around the chessboard and not consider the unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm. Right. So speaking of the unintended consequences, and getting to, I know, an issue that you do a lot of work on, could you sort of briefly characterize how what we're calling this massive transnational movement called the Arab Spring, how the Arab Spring is playing out in Palestine? Now, obviously, we know about what's been happening between Fatah and Hamas. We know about the various leaks and so forth that have been coming out with regard to the peace process between Israel and the Palestinian Authority and so forth. But could you sort of briefly characterize how the Arab Spring matters for Palestine?
Well, it's really interesting, because there was this piece just published today by a former member of the Negotiation Support Unit who claims to be just one of the leakers of those Palestine papers that Al Jazeera and The Guardian put out back in January. This I forget his name, but he was in charge of the refugee file for the Palestinians. And looking back, I remember, and it's funny because I was actually at a conference on the Israeli-Palestinian issue in Brussels, and this story broke while I was in the air. So I landed in D.C. and you turned on my BlackBerry, and it started to load up these emails, and all of a sudden I just started reading all these emails. Oh my goodness, have you seen this? Blah blah blah. So it was just like both barrels of this story. But then a few days later, the story was essentially Bigfooted by Tahrir Square. As Egypt really, Tunisia had been happening. Tunisia really started going, and then Tahrir started going. And it was funny because Al Jazeera, a lot of people, especially in Palestine, saw Al Jazeera as sort of a villain for trying to embarrass Fatah and the PLO. But within a matter of days, Al Jazeera became the heroes of Tunisia and Tahrir Square. I think rightly, because Al Jazeera played an enormous role in helping these demonstrations succeed. But it's the immediate, and I agreed with this, and I wrote this. While it's good to have some openness, and it's good, I think, to understand what a farce these negotiations were, just being completely mismanaged by the U.S. or managed in a way that was so just manifestly unfair. In favor of the Israelis and against the Palestinians.
Well, guaranteed to fail, right? Managed in a way that guaranteed failure.
Well, I think so. There was just no frame of reference. It was the Palestinians were essentially forced to come to the table and accede to, the Israelis playing Calvin ball. They come and define different terms. Okay, we're not going to talk about borders. We're talking about realities on the ground, which we're in the process of changing with settlements every day. But the immediate takeaway was, unfortunately, this is going to benefit Hamas against Fatah. But months later, what has happened? You had these demonstrations. You have Syria in trouble. You've got a new Egyptian government, which is not yet democratic, but is certainly more accountable, and that means they're less inclined to enforce U.S. and Israeli red lines.
Right. Well, you even have people competing in the Egyptian. People who are running for president are competing about being friendly to Palestine policy. Right. El Baradei and so forth.
Yeah, surprise, people actually care about the issue, as they've been telling pollsters for decades. But my point is, the immediate reaction was that this is going to benefit Hamas against Fatah, but I think what has happened months later is that actually Hamas is in trouble because of its patron in Syria, facing these demonstrations. And so what happened is that I think Hamas actually came to this agreement more or less on Fatah's terms. So it's much less of a loss. Months later, it looks like much less of a loss for Fatah. Now, that's not necessarily great for the peace process. It's not. I think it's strengthened certain elements within Fatah as well, who are not the least corrupt. And I mean, a real question also remains: what's going to happen with Salam Fayyad? I think this has strengthened elements in Fatah which have always hated Fayyad. Hamas hates Fayyad, and it would be a shame to really lose, some of the state building progress that he's played an enormous role in. But I mean, I guess my point is just that months later, it's certainly not a clear win for Hamas.
Right. Well, Hamas just had an own goal with the Osama bin Laden death too, right? I mean, where the leader of Hamas publicly mourned the death of. I mean, that's at least what I read, right? Is that correct?
I think so. I mean, I think that was really stupid. Obviously, it was morally and politically stupid. But I think I would look at that also, not to excuse it in any sense, but just to try to understand it, is that they understand that coming into this agreement as they did, more on Fatah's terms that they wanted to, they needed to protect their extremist flank. They needed a way of saying, we're still hardcore, even though we came to this deal in a way that Fatah wanted us to. We're still hardcore, and I mean they've got a challenge in Gaza from extremist Salafist movements, which they've been battling. So yeah, I think it was a way of kind of demonstrating that they're not selling out.
Right. That's very interesting. It's very interesting. I mean, thinking about it as effectively a domestic political maneuver is very interesting because it obviously places them at tension with a whole set of other outcomes. Although, I mean, Hamas' reputation in the West is such already that it probably doesn't injure them that much in terms of what people think about him. So, oh, well, they think that everybody who hates him already is going to say, oh, well, they loved bin Laden and so forth. So I guess it doesn't really change anyone's mind. Well, all right. I mean, do you want to say anything more? Or do we want to probe any more topics on the Arab Spring directly? Because I know we did want to talk a little bit about the impact of the death of Osama bin Laden in the United States and the domestic political dynamics within the U.S.
Yes. Let's move on.
Okay. People have been saying, and Michael Cohen at Democracy Arsenal, I think, recently wrote a piece, sort of openly.
It was in the Atlantic.
Was it in the Atlantic? Okay. Well, Michael Cohen of Democracy Arsenal wrote a piece in the Atlantic, sort of openly wondering whether the death of Osama bin Laden is also the death of a narrative of democratic foreign policy weakness. Sort of suggesting that, I think, suggesting correctly that this is a massive success, that it displays all of these things which seem to be valued in American politics, such as toughness, decisiveness, whatnot, and so that it will be difficult from here on out to characterize the Democratic Party in the same way as it has been characterized since the 1970s, which is a weak on terrorism, or weak on communism, weak on terrorism. The Republican Party has always had more sort of stronger nationalist and stronger defense cred, which is actually a reversal. I mean, that's a reversal of sort of the relationship between the parties in toughness that was the case before World War II, but that we may then see a reversal again, right? But potentially even abetted by some developments within the Republican Party, right? The rise of the Ron and Rand Paul faction of the party, which are quite isolationist. And this has spurred a lot of attention. But anyway, so I mean, I guess what are your initial thoughts on this hypothesis?
Well, I don't think Mike. I mean, I think it was a good and interesting article. I don't think he was actually arguing that that's going to happen. I think he's just kind of saying, this gives Obama and the Democrats, a big card to play, a big demonstration here that when it comes down to it, we know how to handle national security. And I think that's right. I think there are, obviously there are conservatives who are never going to buy that. There are Americans who kind of are steeped in this idea that, Democrats are all a bunch of hippies. But I think Ben Adler actually had a very interesting piece that came out before Mike Cohen's piece that looked at, saying that don't expect this to change the debate because the Republicans, it has nothing to do with evidence. It has everything to do with Republicans being the party of white American nationalism. And as such, Republicans will always have an edge on nationalistic, tough on insert enemy of the moment here arguments. And I think there's a lot to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. It's also really interesting in the context of there were some several blog posts from several major bloggers that came out over the last week that talked about Fox viewers, but sort of white Americans more generally, having a widespread sense of racial grievance. That there is, sort of given the distribution of wealth and political power in the United States, a surprising amount of feeling among white Americans that I'm a white American, are positively discriminated against by the government, by industry, and so forth. And so this was talked about in the context, and they talked about this in the context of sort of Rush Limbaugh and movement conservatism and Fox News and so forth, which definitely feeds into, and I also read Adler's article, definitely feeds into the argument that I think Adler was making there about the Republican Party fundamentally being the party of white nationalism. But, and here is why that I want to return to. So I'm not technically in Kentucky right now. I'm actually in Ohio, although some people call Cincinnati the Kentucky part of Ohio. But anyway, my senator, when I go back to Kentucky, because I work there and I'm there all the time, my senator is Rand Paul. And Rand Paul and his father, and I think a growing selection from the Republican Party, definitely maintain this understanding of white grievance, right? I mean, you could even argue that Rand Paul's entire candidacy is built around thinly disguised white grievance. But their attitude towards forceful nationalism is considerably different than what Adler is talking about here, than this traditional Republican hawkishness on foreign policy, anti-communism, anti-terrorism, and so forth. And so I wonder if even to the extent that we come to perceive the Republican Party as increasingly dominated by this concept of white nationalism and white privilege, if that really means that it has to remain the party of hawkish nationalism at the same time. Because I guess I'm just not convinced, and I think that there are some interesting counter-arguments that say that even on foreign policy you might get a switch. I mean, you might see a sort of much more isolationist inclined Republican Party where you have still what is a liberal hawkish Democratic Party.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think
This would make Eli Lake cry. It would literally, this happening would literally make Eli cry.
I don't want that to happen.
Nobody wants that to happen. Nobody wants that to happen. Not a pretty sight, but anyway.
I've seen him cry. It's not pretty.
No, that's right.
But, I think it'll take a while. I mean, I've been very, very interested. This is something that I noticed even shortly after the 2008 election. Right after Obama took office, I think a lot of people were trying to downplay the challenge on foreign policy issues that the Tea Party represented. And I think a lot of people, I was one of them, who kind of noticed it pretty early. And it's only gotten worse. I don't think anybody can, or worse, or it's gotten more. I don't think anybody can deny it at this point. But given the neoconservatives and the active interventionist wing of the conservatives still kind of control, I guess, the commanding heights of policymaking, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Right.
You would have to have sort of an insurgency against the policy elite that it doesn't really seem. I mean, the elite, the policy elite of the Republican Party controls very carefully, is very careful about budget discipline, is very careful about patronage, and it's hard to see an insurgency developing against that.
Right. I mean, they don't have a kind of policy-making infrastructure. I mean, you've got Cato, and I think I disagree with a lot of what they do, but I think they do solid, serious work. But I think they lack an infrastructure yet to kind of really insert that into the policy-making process. But I wouldn't be surprised if that changes over the next 10 years.
Right. Yeah, that'd be very, very interesting. So, again, can we agree on this point that we're both sort of intrigued by this, but we're both a little bit skeptical that these lines that have characterized American politics, at least since the 1970s. And probably, I think it would probably be correct to say even since the 1950s, when Republicans regularly hit Democrats as weak on defense, weak on communism, that this line is going to remain in place, at least in sort of vague terms, for the future. Whatever, I mean, that the Osama bin Laden killing is not fundamentally going to change this dynamic in American politics. Then.
No, I think I mean, it goes back centuries. It's just like a basic human instinct. It's like the guy who comes up and says, listen, they're out there, they want to kill us, and I want to defend us. And my opponent is a wimp. I mean, that's a very simple pitch. And whoever can kind of wiggle that lever effectively is going to have an inherent advantage, I think.
Yeah, listen, I mean, and I hate to go back to this, but I think it's more complicated, and I'm gonna go into storytelling mode here for a second. But I think this is a useful and interesting story in relation to these ideas in the context of American politics. So many years ago, the British, the Royal Navy, when the British were still the world's most important country, built a impressive new battleship called the Dreadnought. This was both the largest and most powerful battleship in the world. It rendered every other battleship in the world obsolete, sort of at a stroke. Sort of ironically, most of the other battleships in the world were owned by the British, and so many people thought of that as an own goal. And almost immediately, in the United States, you had people talking about how desperately we needed to match the British achievement. And so there were already some sort of similar battleships on the line, but we began developing a new ship, which would eventually be the USS Delaware, that was larger and more powerful than Dreadnought. But in the appropriations battle for this ship, and I wish I could remember his name, but a Democratic congressman, Southern Democrat from Mississippi, said on the House of the Floor of Representatives, I definitely think, and I'm paraphrasing here, I most certainly think that we should build this new mighty ship to go and compete against the British. And in fact, I think we should name it the Scared of Nothing, because, of course, the British were the Dreadnought, and so the American ship would be the Scared of Nothing. And then we should put President Roosevelt and his administration, his entire cabinet, on the foredeck of the ship and send our ship out to have a gunnery duel with the British ship. And that's sort of fascinating. In the context of American politics today, could you imagine any political actor anywhere making a similar set of claims? Right, one that basically said, the President of the United States should go out and get himself killed because this is really stupid. Like, building this ship is really stupid just to compete with the British. And this, I think, reveals a certain isolationist element within American politics that has been there for a very long time. A certain element that has been skeptical about foreign intervention, that has been skeptical about the United States playing a large role in the international sphere, that before World War II was skeptical of high defense budgets.
No, I agree. I mean, that's pretty much Ron Paul right there, isn't it?
Right.
But yeah, I mean, World War II, and I think what World War II gave us is this idea that, yeah, we've got the military power, and if we just put our mind to it, we can do it. And anybody who says otherwise is a defeatist and a declinist. Right. I mean, I think that's what I mean. Having just returned from my first visit ever to Berlin, which I was very short, but I still enjoyed. Just being. It doesn't take much walking around Berlin to kind of get a sense of the ghosts, and the impact of these of the 20th century. And one of the things that's always struck me about Europe versus, and I think this is another story. We just lost, what was it, about a week and a half ago, the last World War I combat veteran. Right. Did you see the story?
I did, yeah. In last one.
Yeah, in Australia, right?
Yeah. He was British, but he moved to Australia.
Right. And just the completely divergent experience of World War I between Americans and Europeans.
Right.
Whereas as far as Americans are concerned, yeah, we showed up at the end and we cleaned up. It was awesome, and then we went home. Europeans, needless to say, had a very different experience. And then World War II, which is obviously more difficult and was a much more mass mobilization and more deeply felt, but still the end result was we came, we saw, we kicked ass, and we can do it again. And that's just deeply, deeply ingrained in the American psyche.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, from this weighty topic, I think it's important for us to move on to the question of Osama bin Laden's porn.
Mm-hmm.
Which I believe that, I mean, you described as either a reality or, and I think you privately described this, or the greatest psyop ever, but who cares, because nobody will ever know in any direction, right?
We came, we saw, we stole his porn.
We stole his porn, yes. Now,
yeah.
I don't know, I mean, I guess, what are your initial reactions to the story of Osama bin Laden's porn? Beyond.
You know, it was the greatest story of yesterday. What else is there to say? I saw a real missed strategic messaging opportunity by not saying that this was actually Zawahiri's porn, that bin Laden was only filming. Right. I think, you know, our friend Eli tweeted, "Please let it be gay porn," and my response to that would be, "Please let it be Israeli gay porn."
Right. Right.
But, you know, yeah, maybe it is, maybe it isn't psyops, but who cares? It's a great story. I don't know really what else to say. But
right. I mean, we should say that it's, you know, just, I'm sure that a substantial portion of 55-year-old men, sort of especially ones that have been stuck in the house for 6 years, have caches of porn. I mean, I am kind of curious. You do have to sort of worry about the mechanism, right? I mean, did he bring it with him from Tora Bora? Did he have, like, specific porn delivery mechanisms?
Yeah, see,
like,
that's what I want.
I'm the porn guy. I'm the porn guy.
Yes.
Like the Potato Man at a U2 concert. I'm the porn guy. Porn guy.
No, I want to know. I want to know that's how we got him.
Right.
Is the guy
that would be great.
Yes. It's the guy bringing him the porn. That was the weak link.
Oh, that would be awesome. That would be fantastic. That would be fantastic.
So,
I mean, and at least to this point, we don't have any indication that he videotapes himself while watching porn. I mean, that would be, I guess, you know, one step a little bit farther. That would be sort of even more awesome. But we don't quite have
I would
that
put
yet.
that among the, you know, the death pictures as things I don't need to see, but you know.
Right. Right.
But yeah, I don't really have anything else witty to say here.
Well, there just aren't any. I mean, there aren't enough good jokes about it, because I mean, something that the jokes are so obvious. I mean, I guess that this came out either yesterday or the day before, so Stewart and Colbert really didn't have an opportunity to joke about this. I don't think. I could be wrong about that. But I don't know. I mean, what do you do with this, right? I mean, it's so hilarious in and of itself. But, and, you know, not to suggest a moral equivalence, but there are arguments that particularly, I mean, in the United States, that porn is very heavily used among the most religious parts of the American community. Right, that conservative religious men use porn very extensively, which I think brings us right.
Let him with the free hand cast the first stone. You know.
Exactly. There we go. And that, I think, brings us to our next obvious topic, which is to talk about the weather, and to talk about whether pornography or greenhouse gases are responsible for the bad weather in the United States. And I think there's a good argument to make made on either side.
Yeah, I do.
Is it coal or is it porn?
No, I think I feel I'm like, I need to get my bearings here, because we have these horrible floods, and it's a huge tragedy, and I don't mean to make light of it at all, but I feel like I need some guidance here from Pat Robertson on who to blame, the gays or the feminists or the porn consumers. I mean, who's done it to us this time? I mean, John Hagee told us that, you know, it was a gay parade, I think, that caused Hurricane Katrina. So I'm looking to our right-wing evangelical clerics here to tell us who to blame for these massive floods.
Right, and although I mean Cincinnati itself I mean, there has been substantial flooding in and around Cincinnati, although most of the really low-lying parts of Cincinnati aren't inhabited, so it's just like, that means flooding like near the old airport and so forth. My softball season has been ruined by these floods, which I know is not the greatest tragedy.
So you have a special grievance.
Right, I have a special grievance. I mean, certainly this area has been afflicted by what seems to be an inordinate amount of tornado warnings. And in fact, 2 weeks ago when I recorded one of these with Daniel Larison, there was a tornado warning in effect while I was recording. And I made some quip about it, where if I get sucked out of the window, something tragic will happen, or it would be terrible, which obviously it would have been, but it was a quip. And that was the same day that the tornadoes struck Alabama and killed 115 people or something along those lines. So, I mean, obviously, our discussing floods here should not be meant to disparage the people who are in Mississippi River floodplains, who are going to be experiencing so obviously very substantial destruction. And I think the river's not even supposed to crest until tomorrow. So, I mean, it is interesting, though, that whenever we have tragedies like this, there seems to be a quest for a cause to these tragedies, right? Even stuff like Katrina and stuff like tornadoes and floods and so forth. And from the scientific community, and even though the science about particular weather happenings is unclear, right? I mean, there's sort of a general sense that we're going to have more extreme weather as climate change goes on, and that while you can't necessarily draw a direct correlation between bad hurricanes, bad tornadoes, and tremendous floods, that this is the sort of thing we will see more of in the future if we don't do anything to manage our Earth. But I think what you were getting at in that comment about Pat Robertson is that American right-wingers have sort of fundamentally rejected that cause. And just in the last 3 or 4 years, right? The rejection has now become above board completely. Tim Pawlenty has apologized for ever thinking that something like this might have happened. And, if he ever whispered something, cap and trade, then he was wrong about that. And so, I think...
No, it has joined the kind of suite of utterly batshit positions that you must embrace to be a serious national Republican candidate. Yes. Right,
exactly. And I'm actually kind of curious about what John Huntsman's position is. He's not a serious national Republican candidate, although he seems to think he is. But anyway, and so...
I mean, on that, I'm sorry, don't mean to interrupt, but I just, on the kind of unscientific tip, I mean, I saw yesterday... really disappointed. I'm not, a supporter of Chris Christie, the New Jersey governor, much. I understand why people like him. But even he was asked about evolution, and he said, well, I think local, it's a local issue. People should determine locally whether they want to teach creationism as part of science. And it's like he's smart enough to know that that's just ridiculous. But the fact is, if he wants a political future, he needs to kind of, put the clown makeup on every once in a while.
Right. One thing I hope about Chris Christie, and I was sort of hoping this about Haley Barbour too, and it's something that disappointed me about Mike Huckabee. And I mean this utterly serious, and it shouldn't be understood as anything but utterly serious. It's a sort of a little bit jokey, but I hope that if Chris Christie someday runs for the Republican nomination, that he doesn't lose any weight. And I mean that because the United States is sort of our culture continues to be replete with negative images of heavy men and heavy women especially. And Mike Huckabee lost how many pounds just so he could run for president. And, I'm not saying we need another William Howard Taft, but I actually think it would be healthy for the United States. We live in a country where Bill Clinton was talked about as a fat man. Right? Which was absurd, right? It was just ridiculous, right? And so, I hope that, in the future, Haley Barbour or Chris Christie, they run as genuinely heavy
large-sized men,
right, genuinely large-sized men. And I really think that potentially it might do something about our sizist culture if somebody like that won the presidency, if a large man won the presidency.
It's one of the number of issues that are even harder for women. So.
Right. No, exactly. Right. I mean, the physical attacks, or the attacks on the physical appearance of both Hillary Clinton and Michelle Obama.
Right.
Not I mean, they're just absurd. Right.
No, it's a good point.
Right. Anyway, where were we? Oh, we were talking about climate change, and so there is this need to find a reason, and there is also this need among Republicans to reject the most plausible reason and cause. And so that's why it's entirely reasonable to sort of wonder, who is Pat Robertson going to blame for this horrible weather that's happening? And, you know, is it, as you suggested, going to be the gays, going to be the Sharia compliant Muslims? Who is it going to be who gets blamed for these horrible things happening to the United States? Because you know it's going to be somebody, right? It is a vengeance of God for something we've done wrong. Because we can't really, you know, come up with any other answer that's plausible.
Yep.
All right, well, is that it?
All right. Thanks a lot.
Okey-dokey. Well, then, yeah, no, Blogging Heads viewers, thank you very much. You know, come back anytime. We'll be here. I mean, not necessarily us, but people like us will be here. So,
Others,
and, yeah, others. And Matt, fantastic. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks a lot, Rob. See you later.
All right, talk to you later.